Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. How do you like that intro? It's very natural. Anyway, that was dumb. Today I'm talking to you about something a bit more technical, and it is a question that I've received. And I've received some form of it over the years. Recently, I received a pretty precise form of it right here as a comment on the YouTube channel. And so I wanted to address it a bit more in detail. And this has to do with there in the specific example, it was interjections, but I want to talk about interjections, expressions, proper names as well, and stuff like that, and how they should be translated into the target language, from the source language into the target language. Should they be translated? How should they be translated? How can they be translated? So let's get into that a bit more in detail. So first of all, what do we mean by expressions, interjections, stuff like that? Well, it can mean a lot of things. The question that I got had to do specifically with interjections in the sense of stuff like, or oh dear, or oh my, or wow. And how do you translate these when you don't have a precise equivalent in the target language or when it would sound a bit off? And so let's deal with that specifically first. My advice for these is usually you hear these when you're talking about dialogue, conversation, stuff like that. And so here you want to convey the same feeling, right? If I'm overwhelmed, let's say, and I say, oh dear, what am I going to do? And I'm translating it into Italian. Well, literally translating oh dear would be o caro, but that's not an expression in Italian, right? You wouldn't use that in that sense. And so that would just sound off. So obviously you don't do that, but you try to come up with an equivalent. So what would someone in that situation say? Like if they're overwhelmed, say, and they say, oh dear, what would they say? They would say, I don't know, like, oh cavolo, or oh no. So, oh cavolo literally means oh cabbage, which is obviously not an expression in English. But you try to look for the equivalent in the target language. So in this sense, when translators do this, and again, this will happen more in literary translations or possibly in stuff where you're translating dialogue, stuff like that. But you're not going to find it in engineering or legal translations as much. You might find a bit of it in legal, or finance translation, stuff like that. You won't find it. But how do you deal with this? Well, again, you put yourself in in the situation of that person. They're feeling overwhelmed. They're like, oh cavolo, oh no, oh no, come faccio, like something like that. And you try to think of a person in those shoes in that situation, what they would say. And so in these situations, you very much have to, more than just translate, you have to interpret. You have to kind of figure out on your own, based on your judgment, what they would say. But let's go through some other examples, because you have stuff like expressions, right? Like if you want to say something, I don't know, don't look a gift horse in the mouth, or whatever the expression is. No one really says that way. What? Strike while the iron's hot. You need to strike while the iron's hot, or he has an axe to grind, or something like that. Obviously, you don't translate these literally in whatever language you're translating into, but usually they have an equivalent. One I had recently was now I can't remember the original in English. It was something like let's cut through the red tape, or something like that. And but the equivalent in Italian would be tagliamo la testa al toro, which means let's cut the bull's head. Actually, in English it might have been let's cut out the BS or something like that. But anyway, and so often you won't have the exact same expression or metaphor, simile, or what have you, but you will have an equivalent that gets used in those situations. And often you have dictionaries that have equivalents of these, but not all the time. But yeah, in these cases as well, you should not do a literal translation because it won't work. And chances are that the literal translation, sometimes it exists in the target language, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it exists, but not in the same context. And so you should do something different. And often you have similar ones. And this is an example that I've given before, but when I was a little kid, the movie Look Who's Talking came out. And I remember reading the paper in Italian, and this was before it was, movies used to come out, I think they still come out, later in Italy than they did in the US. And so we'd hear about them first, and then later they'd come out months later. And so this is before it came out, so before it had the official title. But they were talking about it in the newspaper, and they said, oh, this movie called Guarda chi parla. And I remember it sounded weird, but that was a literal translation. Look who's talking, guarda chi parla. Obviously, when the movie came out, it was called Senti chi parla. Listen to who's talking, because that's how you say the expression in Italian. It's a bit different. Instead of look who's talking, you say listen to who's talking. And you need to take these into account when you do translations. So yeah, that covers interjections, expressions. And the other thing, and the other one, the one that I come across more often because I deal with legal and business translations, is names of, say, laws or something like that. Because these can be difficult because they really depend. And usually, like I'm dealing a lot with Switzerland, and we'll have a law that's written up in one of the Swiss languages, and we need to know if there's an equivalent in the target language, or if there should be or not, or what. And it can really get complicated because, so for example, if there's a Swiss law and it has a name in Italian, but I'm translating it into English, first of all, I'm going to check if there's an official one. And there's an official Swiss website which has it. But let's say there isn't one. Then I need to check, the various places to check if it's been translated before by others to see if that works. And you can look through all that. Otherwise, usually what they'll have is like legge di something something in Italian, and then it'll have like LDIP, the initials. But what you do in English is there's several options you can do. You can leave it as is, which you wouldn't do in this situation, or you can leave it as is and then in parentheses put the equivalent in English, which often works, or you put the equivalent in English and then, but instead of LDIP, because it won't be legge di something something, it'll have a different acronym. So you should put that acronym, except usually when you translate it to English, it's translated from the German and not from the Italian, because German is the main language of Switzerland, even though it's not the only official one. And so previous translations will have the abbreviation in German. So you need to follow that. So it can get very complicated is what I'm saying. But the best way to go about it is to see, first of all, if the government has ever issued an official translation. And this, or if you're dealing with EU languages, see if the EU has ever translated before or stuff like that. And see if it's been done in the past. And there are various websites for this, reverso.com, lingui.com, Word Reference very often has discussions on this, obviously pros.com as well. But, go through this. If it hasn't been done before, then you need to figure out how to translate it, except when you don't. Another recent example that I had was there's a law, this isn't Swiss, I think this is an Italian law, the mille proroghe, which was a law or a decree. And mille proroghe literally means 1,000 extensions. But I'm not going to call it the 1,000 extension decree because that makes no sense. So I call it the mille proroghe decree. And you need to keep it in that case because it became the name, the proper name of this new decree, the 1,000 extension decree. And that's just what it's called, even though it has, even when you're not dealing with extensions per se, that's the name of the decree. And so you have to call it mille proroghe. And even though in English it doesn't mean anything. And there what we had to put was, we put mille proroghe and then in parentheses an explanation of what the law is. Law handling blah, 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 blah in Italy. And close parentheses. So yeah, so it can get quite complicated. But this is why it really is a judgment call. The important thing, but let me, after saying all that, let me say what you should not do. You should not, if you see LDIP, don't just write LDIP in the target language. You need to figure out what LDIP stands for. You have to. And then you can decide if you want to leave it LDIP, change the acronym, spell it out, or in some other way make it clear to the person reading it what you're talking about. So all too often I see people do this, especially with legal translations or even business translations, stuff like that. They'll see something, and you see with elementary stuff too. Like I'll see, they might be discussing the EU, and it'll have like an EU law. It'll say EU, blah, 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 blah. And then the target language, it'll say EU, blah, blah, blah. Except the target language is Italian or French or something like that, where EU is not EU, but it's UE, right? Unión Europea. And so, and you need to take that into account when you do these translations. And so it can get quite complicated, but you need to keep track of these. And I know these examples have been sort of all over the place, but this is a very big topic, very broad, and it really depends on your specialization. And I wanted to touch a bit on each. Feel free to let me know if you have some other specialization, how it works for you, or if you have other examples and how it works for you. But I know this is a big thing for people doing translations, and I've seen people mess it up quite a bit. And they're just things you need to keep in mind. If you're doing dialogue, it needs to sound natural. When you're talking about laws and decrees and regulations, you need to make sure it's very clear what you're referring to. If someone wrote LDIP in a source thing, don't just write LDIP in the target. You need to know what it refers to. If you can't figure it out, ask the client, but usually with some research you can figure it out because the contract is there to be clear, so people can know what's being discussed. But that's pretty much it. I'll just leave it at that for now. Otherwise, I could keep going and talking on forever. But this is an important point. And if you want, I can go in more in depth in the future about certain aspects of it, but it's just something to definitely keep in mind when you're doing these translations. And so to be very careful when you're dealing with them, because they can be, they're very important often, especially when you're dealing with these business legal translations. But otherwise they can just confuse people. If you literally translate a metaphor or simile and it makes no sense in the target language, they'll be like, what are you talking about? So yeah, it's just something to keep in mind. That's pretty much it though for now. I'll leave it at that. And otherwise I will talk to you next time. Okay, thanks. Bye. Savedum.